They would remember her as a ghost, a whisper in the machine of their memory. She had arrived as a footnote and departed as a legend, a woman who answered a major's scream of fury with a silence that dismantled his world. In the heart of a dying mountain, under the weight of an enemy's assault, she taught them that true authority is not worn on a collar, but wielded in the mind. The question he shrieked in the chaos was, "Who do you answer to?" He expected a name, a rank, a department. He never imagined the answer would be the mountain itself. The air in Deep Command Post Scylla, known colloquially and with a shudder as the Needle, was a finely tuned cocktail of recycled oxygen, nitrogen, and the persistent metallic tang of ozone leaking from overworked server racks. It was a dead air, scrubbed of all organic life, of pollen, of the memory of rain or soil. It carried only the scent of the machine that was the bunker itself, a 3-kilometer deep spike of plasteel and reinforced concrete driven into the granite heart of the Argus mountain range. Down here, silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was a low, subaudible hum that vibrated through the soles of one's boots, the thrum of the geothermal power core, and the massive life support systems that made existence possible in the crushing lithospheric pressure. It was a silence that felt like a weight. Dr. Aris Thorne felt that weight not as a burden, but as a medium. To her, the silence was a vast, dark ocean, and she was the sole bathysphere pilot exploring its depths. She sat at a non-standard monitoring station, a custom rig shunted into a forgotten alcove of the command and control center. It was an island of bespoke technology in a sea of uniform military issue consoles. Her 3 screens glowed with data that no one else in the Needle understood or cared to. They were not tactical maps or troop movements, but flowing multicolored waterfalls of geophysical data. Spectrograms detailed the mountain's micro-tremors. Gravimetric sensors mapped the minute density shifts in the rock strata miles away. Long-range acoustic sensors, tuned to the infrasonic, listened to the groans of the tectonic plate itself. She was a geologist, or so her paperwork stated, a civilian attachment from the Subterranean Warfare Analysis Division. To the uniformed personnel of the Needle, she was an anomaly, a quiet woman in a plain gray jumpsuit who kept to herself and stared at what looked like psychedelic screensavers all day. She was small, with a compact frame that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her face, devoid of makeup or expression, was a study in placid neutrality. Her eyes were the only active thing about her. They moved with a slow, deliberate cadence across the lines of code and the shifting waveforms, seeing not just data, but a language. The mountain was speaking, and she was its only interpreter. Her fingers moved with an unnerving economy across a keyboard that was split into 2 ergonomic halves. She was not typing words, but commands, running diagnostic filters on the incoming sensor feeds. A new harmonic had appeared in the last rotation cycle, a faint, rhythmic pulse buried deep within the background noise of the planet. It was too regular for a natural seismic event, too consistent for tectonic stress. It was artificial. It was a pattern. She isolated the frequency, a low thrum at 12.4 Hertz, and began running propagation models. The signal was originating from the northeast, approximately 70 kilometers out, and it was getting stronger. Its waveform was a perfect sawtooth, a signature of deep earth drilling, or, more likely, a resonance weapon in its calibration phase. She cross-referenced the signal's vector with known geological faults and underground river systems. The source was leveraging a massive limestone aquifer as a waveguide, channeling the vibrations with frightening efficiency directly toward the granite pluton that housed the needle. They were being targeted. The ambient noise of the CIC was a controlled chaos. Voices spoke in clipped, professional tones, reporting status updates. Keyboards clicked. The main strategic display, a giant hololith in the center of the room, showed friendly and suspected enemy positions on the surface, miles above their heads. The conflict up there, in the snow and the wind, felt like a distant abstraction. Here, the only enemy was a system failure, a circuit breaker trip, a loss of pressure. The commander of this subterranean world, Major Valerius, stalked the command deck like a caged predator. Major Kalen Valerius was a man forged in the crucible of traditional warfare. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that seemed permanently clenched and a voice that was a blunt instrument used to hammer subordinates into compliance. His uniform was impeccable. His boots gleamed even in the filtered light of the CIC, and the eagle on his collar was a point of immense, almost religious pride. He understood chain of command, fire superiority, and the unyielding importance of protocol. He did not understand nuance, data he could not see on a tactical map, or civilian specialists who did not show what he considered the proper deference to his rank. He saw Eris Thorne not as an asset, but as a bureaucratic burden, a civilian scientist foisted upon his command by some high-level strategic body that knew nothing of the realities of running a forward operating base. He paused in his pacing to glower at her alcove. "Dr. Thorne," he called out, his voice echoing slightly in the vast chamber. The use of her title was not a mark of respect, but a subtle demarcation, separating her from his world of ranks and rates. "Is your project yielding any results, or are you still watching the pretty lights?" A few of the junior officers nearby smirked. Thorne did not look up from her screen. Her focus was absolute, her mind tracing the path of the 12.4 Hertz signal as it refracted through a layer of metamorphic schist. "The mountain is becoming agitated, Major," she said, her voice flat and devoid of inflection. It was a simple statement of fact. Valerius snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound. "The mountain can be agitated all it wants. My concern is the enemy armor division massing near Pass 17. Real threats, Doctor. Tangible ones." He tapped a manicured finger on the hololith, indicating a cluster of red icons miles away on the surface. To him, the war was a two-dimensional problem. He could not, or would not, conceive of a third axis of attack from below. He saw her work as a frivolous academic exercise, a waste of power and space. The needle was a fortress of rock and steel, impregnable. The thought that the rock itself could be turned against them was an absurdity he refused to entertain. He turned away, dismissing her and her quiet warning, and resumed his patrol of the command deck, his boots striking the metal floor with a rhythmic, authoritative report that was, in its own way, a signal of its own, a signal of rigid, unyielding confidence in a world he believed he completely controlled. Thorne, however, knew better. She was listening to the world beneath his feet, and it was telling a very different story. The tension in the needle had been ratcheting up for 3 days. The surface conflict was escalating, and the reports filtering down from the besieged garrisons were grim. The air, already thin on sentiment, grew sharp with unspoken anxiety. Valerius convened briefings every 4 hours, a relentless cycle of status reports that did little more than confirm their isolation. It was in one of these briefings that the friction between the Major's rigid authority and Thorne's silent competence became a public spectacle. The command staff and senior non-commissioned officers were gathered in the briefing theater, a tiered amphitheater facing a massive, high-resolution screen. Valerius stood at the podium, his presence dominating the room. Comms reports intermittent jamming across all high-frequency bands, he announced, his voice a low growl of frustration. Logistics confirms our last surface resupply was compromised. We are on our own until Task Force Chimera can break through. ETA is now estimated at 96 hours, minimum. He let that sink in, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his subordinates, demanding their focus, their fear, their absolute reliance on his leadership. His eyes eventually settled on Thorne, who was seated in the back row, her usual gray jumpsuit a stark contrast to the digital camouflage patterns of everyone else. She was not looking at him, but at a small data slate in her lap, her brow furrowed in concentration. This quiet disregard was a match to Valerius's short fuse. He saw it as a personal affront, a challenge to the sanctity of his command. He stopped his briefing mid-sentence. The abrupt silence drew all eyes. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Are we boring you?" Thorne looked up slowly, her eyes taking a moment to adjust from the glow of her slate to the dim light of the theater. She blinked once, her expression unreadable. "No, Major," she replied, her voice as calm and steady as the deep rock around them. "Then perhaps you'd care to share with the rest of us what is so much more important than the tactical security of this installation?" he challenged, his voice rising in volume. He was making an example of her, using his rank as a cudgel. He wanted to see her flustered, to see her stammer an apology. He wanted to re-establish the hierarchy she so effortlessly ignored. Thorne stood, a small, unassuming figure in the large room. She held up the data slate. On its screen was a complex, three-dimensional topographical map of the mountain range, latticed with pulsing lines of energy. "I am modeling the propagation of a low-frequency seismic event, Major, the one I mentioned yesterday." Valerius waved a dismissive hand. "Rock tremors. We are 3 kilometers deep in solid granite, Doctor. This facility is rated to withstand a direct tactical nuclear strike. I think we can handle a few geological hiccups." Laughter, sycophantic and nervous, rippled through the junior officers. "It is not a hiccup," Thorne stated, her voice cutting through the laughter and silencing it. "It is a focused, coherent energy transmission. The source is using the Gal-Teth aquifer system as a resonant waveguide. The signal has increased in amplitude by 47% in the last 12 hours. It is no longer a calibration signal. It is now in an active targeting phase. Based on its current rate of amplification, the focal point of the energy will converge on the coordinates of this command center in approximately 2 hours. A heavy silence fell over the room. The technical precision of her statement, delivered without a hint of emotion, was unsettling. It was Sergeant Eva Rostova, the head of the communications section, who broke the silence. Rostova was a career NCO, sharp and practical, with a healthy skepticism for officers who valued bluster over brains. "A seismic weapon, Doctor?" she asked, her tone genuinely curious. "Of a sort," Thorne confirmed, nodding to the sergeant. "It is not designed to create a cave-in. Brute force would be inefficient. This is more elegant. It is designed to induce a specific resonant frequency in the granite pluton itself. The goal is not to destroy the bunker, but to isolate it. If they can match the resonant frequency of our communications conduits and power feeds, they can induce microfractures in the surrounding rock, severing our connections to the surface. They can turn our greatest strength, the mountain itself, into the walls of our tomb. Valerius's face had become a mask of thunderous fury. She had not only ignored his authority, she had hijacked his briefing with what he perceived as science fiction nonsense. She had presented a threat he couldn't see, couldn't shoot, and couldn't understand. It made him feel powerless, and he despised the feeling. He stepped down from the podium and advanced toward her, his posture radiating menace. "That is enough," he snarled, his voice low and shaking with rage. He was standing directly in front of her now, using his height and physical presence to intimidate. The others in the room shrank back, sensing the imminent explosion. "You are a civilian analyst, a guest. You have no authority here. You do not interrupt my briefings. You do not spread panic with these ghost stories." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a furious whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. "Who do you answer to, Doctor? Who is your commanding officer? Give me a name. Right now." Thorne met his enraged glare without flinching. Her heart rate remained a steady 60 beats per minute. She could feel the faint vibration in the floor, the 12.4 hertz hum that was growing from a whisper to a murmur. She considered his question not as a challenge, but as a data point. He was asking about hierarchy, about a chain of command he understood. He wanted a box to put her in. She chose her response with the same precision she used to filter seismic data. "My work is my authority," she said, her voice a quiet counterpoint to his barely controlled fury. "And the data does not answer to a rank." It was a perfect response. It was factual, it was unassailable, and it offered him nothing to grab onto. It was an intellectual checkmate that bypassed his entire worldview. For a moment, Valerius was speechless, his jaw working silently. The sheer audacity of her calm, logical defiance left him momentarily paralyzed. He was a hammer, and she was water. He could smash and rage, but he could not harm her, could not even leave a mark. He finally found his voice, and it was a choked, strangled thing. "Get out," he hissed. "Return to your station, and you will not speak again unless spoken to. Is that understood?" "Understood," Thorne said, her tone unchanged. She sat down, picked up her data slate, and immediately returned her attention to the pulsing lines on the screen, leaving Major Valerius standing alone in the center of the room, his authority challenged, his rage unspent, and his entire command watching. The silence that followed was more damning than any argument could have been. The seed of doubt had been planted, not by an order, but by a simple, terrifying fact. The crisis did not arrive with a gradual crescendo. It struck like a physical blow. 1 hour and 43 minutes after the briefing, precisely within Thorne's predicted window, the world of the needle fractured. It began not with an explosion, but with a sound. A low, guttural moan rose from the rock itself, a sound so deep and pervasive it seemed to emanate from inside one's own bones. The steady, almost reassuring hum of the facility's machinery was drowned out by this alien vibration. The metal floor plates of the CIC began to shudder, not violently, but with a high-frequency resonance that made teeth ache and vision blur. A fine gray dust, shaken loose from a million microscopic fissures in the concrete, began to drift down from the ceiling, coating every surface in a funereal powder. Red lights flashed on consoles across the room, accompanied by the shrill electronic shrieks of critical failure alarms. "Report!" Valerius bellowed, his voice tight with shock. He gripped the edge of the central hololith table to steady himself, his knuckles white. The tactical display was flickering wildly, entire sections of the surface map dissolving into static. "Losing telemetry from all surface sensor relays," a tech cried out from the sensor station. "The fiber conduits are going dark, one by one. It's like someone is just snipping the lines." "Main power is fluctuating," another voice shouted. "The geothermal core is stable, but the primary transmission lines to the upper levels are showing massive impedance spikes. We're getting catastrophic feedback." Sergeant Rostova's station was a symphony of failure alarms. "Sir, I've lost all high-band comms. SATCOM, microwave relay, troposcatter, all gone. The physical lines are dead. I'm trying to establish a connection on the VLF band, but the noise floor is impossible. It's like the entire mountain is screaming." The vibration intensified. A heavy steel panel tore loose from the ceiling and crashed to the floor with a deafening clang, sending sparks cascading from the severed power lines behind it. Panic, cold and sharp, began to slice through the disciplined veneer of the command center crew. Men and women who had trained for system failures and direct attacks were now faced with an enemy they couldn't comprehend. Their fortress was actively disintegrating around them, not from a bomb, but from a sound. Valerius, his face pale beneath the flashing red emergency lights, fell back on the only thing he knew: orthodox tactical response. "This is a coordinated ECM and sapper attack," he yelled, projecting a confidence he clearly did not feel. "They've gotten teams onto the mountain. They're cutting our lines. I want a full diagnostic on internal security sensors. Seal all blast doors. Arm the internal defense turrets. Get me a damage control team to the main conduit shaft, now." His orders were crisp, textbook reactions to a conventional assault. They were also utterly useless. "Sir, the internal sensors are failing too," an officer reported, his voice cracking. "The vibration is playing hell with the circuitry, and the damage control teams can't get to the main shaft. The turbo lift is offline, and the access corridor is reporting structural integrity warnings." "Then they will take the damn stairs," Valerius roared back, his frustration boiling over into rage. He was trying to hammer the problem into a shape he understood, but it refused to yield. He was giving orders to fight ghosts in the rock. He commanded his troops to charge at an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once. Every new report confirmed the futility of his methods. His worldview, built on the solid bedrock of established protocol, was turning to dust before his eyes. Through it all, Eris Thorne sat at her station. The alcove, set deeper into the primary bedrock, seemed to vibrate with a slightly different, more violent frequency. Her custom rig, however, was built for this. Its components were suspended in a gel matrix within the casing, insulated from the worst of the resonance. While other screens flickered and died, hers remained steady. The waterfall of data had become a raging torrent. The 12.4 Hz signal was no longer a neat sawtooth wave. It was a screaming, jagged blade of pure energy, depicted on her main screen as a blindingly bright line. She was watching the enemy's strategy unfold with clinical detachment. They were brilliant. They had found the precise resonant frequency of the crystalline structure in the granite, turning the quartz and feldspar into microscopic tuning forks. The vibrations were not just shaking the bunker, they were systematically shattering the delicate fiber optic filaments and copper wiring that were its nervous system. Valerius's orders were like telling a man whose spinal cord was being severed to try running faster. She saw the next phase of the attack coalescing on her secondary screen, a new harmonic beginning to build, This one centered at 9.7 hertz. She ran a rapid simulation. The target of this new frequency was not the electronics. Its resonant profile matched the molecular structure of the plasteel alloy used in the bunker's primary structural supports. They were done cutting the lines. Now they were going to start breaking the bones. The shaking subsided for a moment. An eerie, temporary calm descended, broken only by the panicked shouts and the hum of emergency battery power. Valerius seized the lull, mistaking it for a reprieve. "See," he said, his voice strained. "They're falling back. Damage control. I want a full report in 5 minutes." Thorne spoke into the sudden quiet, her voice cutting through the space with the chilling precision of a scalpel. She did not raise it. She did not need to. That was not a retreat, Major. That was a frequency shift. Every eye in the CIC turned to her. In the crimson glow of the emergency lighting, her face was a pale, emotionless mask. "The initial phase is complete. Our external connections are severed." The new harmonic building now, at 9.7 hertz, targets the plasteel support pylons. The next pulse will not be a vibration. It will be a cascade of structural failures, starting with the weakest load-bearing joints. My models predict the first collapse will occur in this room. Specifically, she paused, her eyes tracing an invisible line across the ceiling. At the central arch, right above your hololith table. A collective intake of breath. The crew looked up at the massive arch of steel and concrete above their heads. Valerius followed their gaze, his face a mixture of disbelief and dawning, abject terror. The fortress was a tomb. The protocol was useless. His authority was a ghost. He was out of options, out of ideas, out of time. The system had failed, and the man who ran it had failed with it. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the promise of imminent death. In that moment of collective frozen terror, with the groans of stressed metal beginning to echo through the chamber, authority ceased to be a function of rank. It became a function of competence, and in the needle, there was only one person left who possessed it. Eris Thorne stood up. The movement was unhurried, a simple, declarative act that drew every gaze. The low, menacing hum of the 9.7 hertz frequency was beginning to build again. A vibration felt deep in the chest. Dust rained down from the ceiling in a steady shower. The end was no longer a prediction. It was a physical presence in the room. "Sergeant Rostova," Thorne said, her voice clear and calm, a beacon of pure signal in a storm of noise. She did not look at Major Valerius, who stood paralyzed beside the hololith. He had ceased to be a variable in her equation. "Patch my console into the primary power distribution grid for the geothermal core. I need direct, real-time control over the core's magnetic containment field and the structural resonance dampeners." It was an order, not a request, not a suggestion. It was a command given with the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. It bypassed the entire chain of command, rendering Valerius a spectator to his own obsolescence. For a heartbeat, the room remained frozen. All eyes flicked from Thorne to Valerius, then to Sergeant Rostova. This was the moment of schism. Rostova, her face grim, looked at her major, a man she had served for 2 years, a man whose authority was institutionally absolute. She saw his wide, terrified eyes, his complete lack of a plan. Then she looked at the small woman in the gray jumpsuit, whose expression was one of intense, analytical focus. Rostova was a communications expert. She understood signals, and she recognized the one Thorne was sending, a signal of pure, undiluted competence, Logic, not loyalty, dictated her next action. "Sir?" Rostova asked Valerius, one last, fleeting nod to the collapsing hierarchy. The major just stared, his mouth slightly agape, the word no dying on his lips as a fresh, violent shudder shook the room. A spiderweb of cracks appeared on the wall behind him. That was all the confirmation Rostova needed. She turned to her console, her fingers flying across the keypad with practiced speed. "Bypassing command authority protocols," she announced into her headset, her voice steady. "Executing emergency directive from designated science lead. Patching Dr. Thorne's station into the core distribution network. Now." A schematic of the geothermal core's power grid appeared on one of Thorne's screens. Green lines turned to amber as Rostova rerouted primary control. "You have the con, Doctor," Rostova said, her voice tight. "Grid control is yours." A murmur of shock and relief went through the crew. The spell of paralysis was broken. Authority had not been seized. It had flowed, like water seeking its own level, to the only person capable of wielding it. Thorne's alcove became the new center of the universe. "Ensign," Thorne said, pointing to a young tactical officer cowering near the dead hololith. "Bring up seismic overlay C12 on the forward auxiliary screen. I need a visual representation of the Gal-Teth aquifer." "Crewman," she said to another, "I need you to monitor the thermal bleed from the core's secondary cooling loop. Report any temperature deviation greater than 0.5%. Do not deviate." The orders were precise, counterintuitive, and utterly confident. They were tasks that seemed disconnected from the immediate threat, yet the crew, desperate for direction, obeyed without question. They abandoned their now useless stations and repurposed themselves to her needs. Valerius watched, a statue of impotent fury, as his command was dismantled and reassembled around this quiet, unknown woman. The CIC, which had been descending into chaos, was transformed into a place of focused, desperate purpose. Thorne was no longer an analyst. She was the conductor of a terrifying orchestra, and the instruments were the very bones of the mountain and the heart of the star they had buried beneath it. The deep hum of the 9.7 Hz frequency was now a palpable, physical force. The lights flickered violently, and a long, groaning tear appeared in the central arch above the dead hololith. Concrete dust and metal filings rained down. Time was running out. "Rostova," Thorne said, her eyes locked on her screens, her fingers a blur on the split keyboard. "The enemy is using the aquifer as a passive amplifier. We are going to use it as an active weapon. We will not try to block their resonance. We will overpower it. We are going to turn this entire mountain into a directed energy emitter." A mad, brilliant concept. It was not defense. It was attack, using a form of physics so advanced it bordered on arcane. It was a plan born of a mind that saw the world not as a collection of objects, but as a system of interconnected frequencies. "Core containment field is at your command," Rostova confirmed, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "Perfect," Thorne said, her voice a whisper of clinical satisfaction. The final piece was in place. The turn was complete. Now the solution would begin. The execution was an act of pure, intellectual violence. Thorne's mind, a nexus of geological science, theoretical physics, and network architecture, became the operating system for the entire mountain. While the crew followed her sparse, precise commands, her real work was happening in the silent space between her thoughts and the glowing lines of code on her screens. She was not just giving orders, she was rewriting the laws of their physical reality in real time. I am disengaging the primary resonance dampeners, she announced, her voice as level as a frozen lake. The statement sent a fresh wave of fear through the room. The dampeners were the only things mitigating the destructive vibrations. Turning them off was like opening the floodgates of a dam. "Doctor, that's suicide!" the engineering chief protested, his face ashen. "The resonance will tear us apart in seconds." "The dampeners are designed to absorb and dissipate undirected energy," Thorne countered without looking at him. "Our current situation is one of directed, coherent energy. They are not dampening the resonance. They are absorbing it, saturating, and beginning to amplify it at their own harmonic. They are now part of the problem. Disengaging now." She entered the command. For a terrifying second, the shaking intensified tenfold. The entire bunker screamed, a chorus of tortured metal and stone. A section of the ceiling near the main entrance collapsed completely, showering the deck with debris. It felt like the end, but Thorne was already 3 steps ahead. "Rostova, bring the geothermal core online to 90% of maximum theoretical output," she commanded. "Override all safety protocols. I am taking direct control of the magnetic containment field's modulation. Core output climbing, 70%, 80%. All safeties are bypassed, Doctor. The field is yours." Rostova's voice was strained, her knuckles white on her console. She was asking the reactor to do something it was never designed for. On Thorne's main screen, a sphere of incandescent plasma, the heart of the geothermal core, was now responding to her commands. She was no longer just a geologist. She was shaping the magnetic bottle that held a miniature sun captive. Her fingers danced, not typing words, but sculpting waveforms. She began to modulate the containment field, not randomly, but in a specific counter-frequency pattern. She was turning the core's immense energy output into a signal. She was teaching the star to sing. "I am creating a counter-resonance pulse," she explained to the awestruck crew, her voice a calm lecture in the middle of an earthquake. "The enemy is broadcasting at 9.7 hertz. We will broadcast at 29.1 hertz, the third harmonic. We won't try to cancel their wave. We will ride it, amplify it, and invert its phase at the point of origin." She was using the principles of constructive and destructive interference on a planetary scale. It was a gambit of breathtaking audacity. If her calculations were even a fraction of a degree off, she would amplify the enemy's weapon and shatter the mountain. Or she would lose control of the core and vaporize the entire facility in a flash of plasma. There was no margin for error. "Thermal bleed from the cooling loop is up 1.2%, the crewman she had tasked shouted, his voice high with panic. "Within acceptable parameters," Thorne stated calmly. "Rostova, I need to channel the pulse. Open a pathway. I am routing the energy through the structural pylons themselves. They are no longer supports. They are the barrels of our cannon." This was the masterstroke. Instead of letting the resonance destroy the supports, she was turning them into conduits, focusing the immense power of the core and directing it outward. The entire bunker was being transformed from a target into a weapon. "Pulse is building," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. On her screen, 2 waves were displayed. The angry, jagged red line of the enemy's attack, and her own, a cleaner, higher-frequency blue sine wave. She was manipulating her wave, adjusting its phase and amplitude with microscopic precision, preparing to align it perfectly with the enemy's. "I have a lock on the source emitter's geophysical coordinates." They are using the bedrock directly beneath their weapon as a grounding plate. A foolish mistake. It gives me a perfect target. The room fell into a profound, anticipatory silence, the only sound the high-pitched whine of the overloaded power systems. The shaking had reached a terrifying, constant state. It felt as though the world was ending. "Now," Thorne said. She hit a single key. It was not an explosion. It was a release. A sound unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. A deep, resonant, impossibly pure tone, erupted not from any speaker, but from the very structure of the bunker itself. It was the sound of the mountain singing her song. The energy of the geothermal core, focused by Thorne's will, surged through the plasteel pylons into the granite and coalesced in the Galteth aquifer. For a single, eternal second, the entire Argus mountain range became a colossal tuning fork, struck by the hand of a ghost in a machine. The energy, perfectly focused, traveled back along the enemy's own waveguide at the speed of sound in rock, a silent, invisible spear of pure physics. And then silence, absolute, total, and profound. The shaking stopped. The high-pitched whine of strained machinery died. The groaning of stressed metal ceased. The only sound was the frantic panting of the crew and the gentle hum of the emergency lights. On Thorne's screen, the angry red line of the enemy's 9.7 Hertz signal vanished as if it had never existed. 70 kilometers to the northeast, buried deep beneath the earth, the enemy's seismic resonance weapon, along with the bedrock it was anchored to, had been subjected to a sudden, catastrophic, phase-inverted resonance cascade. The delicate crystals of its focusing array and the rock around it for 100 meters in every direction had been instantaneously turned to something resembling superheated sand. The threat was not just neutralized, it was erased from existence. In the CIC of the needle, no one moved. They stood or sat in the dust-filled air, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. They had been on the precipice of annihilation, only to be saved by a method that defied all known warfare. They looked at the collapsed ceiling panels, the cracked walls, and then they looked at Dr. Eris Thorne. She was already running diagnostics, her expression unchanged. "Core temperature returning to nominal," she said into the quiet. "Structural integrity is compromised at 31 points, but the primary habitat zones are secure, re-engaging resonance dampeners." The transition from weapon back to fortress was complete. The silence that followed her words was one of pure, unadulterated awe. They were alive, and she was the reason. The reckoning began not with a klaxon, but with a quiet, unassuming chime. It was a sound no one in the CIC had heard in days, a sound that should have been impossible. It was the alert for an incoming communication on a channel that was supposed to be dead. Sergeant Rostova stared at her console, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Dr. Thorne," she stammered, the honorific now holding a weight it had never possessed before. "I'm getting a signal. I don't know what it is. It's a quantum-encrypted burst transmission channel, sub-ether. It's not on any of my charts. It's routing directly through your station's primary node." Before Thorne could respond, a voice, crisp and calm, and imbued with an authority that seemed to cut through the very air, filled the CIC. It did not come from the main comm speakers, but from a small, dedicated emitter on Thorne's own console. "Ethel, report," the voice said. It was a simple, two-word command. The name hung in the air, alien and strange. Ethel, Major Valerius, who had been standing in a state of shock, his face a canvas of confusion and humiliation, seemed to snap back to life at the sound of an officer-class voice. This was a world he understood, a superior, a chance to reclaim his narrative. He strode toward Thorne's alcove, his posture regaining some of its former arrogance. "This is Major Valerius, commanding officer of Deep Command Post Scylla," he announced, trying to project his voice toward the small speaker. "To whom am I speaking? Our facility was just subjected to a massive enemy assault, which I—" "Be silent, Major," the voice interrupted, the tone not angry, but utterly, chillingly dismissive. It was the sound of a god swatting a fly. "I am not speaking to you. I am speaking to Ethel. Report." All eyes turned back to Thorne. She showed no surprise, no reaction at all to the name or the voice. She leaned slightly toward her microphone. "The weapon has been neutralized," she stated, her voice as flat and factual as ever. "The needle is secure, but sustained heavy structural and system damage. External communications are severed, pending hardware repair. Personnel are shaken, but casualties are minimal." "Understood," the voice replied. "The weapon was a prototype X4 resonant drill. Your analysis of its capabilities was, as expected, flawless. We tracked the energy signature of your counterpulse, a novel application of the core field modulation. We are impressed." A slight pause. "What is your assessment of the command situation, Ethel?" This was the moment. The question hung in the balance, and Valerius knew it. His career, his honor, his entire world rested on her answer. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself, to assert his authority one last time. Major Valerius relied on outdated protocols for a threat profile he did not comprehend, Thorne said, her voice a clinical recitation of fact. His methods were ineffective and accelerated the decline in crew morale. Command authority collapsed due to a failure of leadership in the face of an unconventional crisis. Sergeant Rostova demonstrated initiative and a superior grasp of logical imperatives. She was instrumental in the execution of the countermeasure. Every word was a nail in Valerius's coffin. It was not an accusation. It was an after-action report, delivered with the emotional detachment of a machine. It was infinitely more damning. Valerius finally broke. The carefully constructed facade of the arrogant officer shattered, revealing the terrified, insecure man beneath. "Lies!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "She disobeyed a direct order. She jeopardized this entire facility with her reckless experimenting. I was in command. I am in command. You have to listen to me. I demand to know who you are. Who do you answer to?" The voice on the comm was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, it was tinged with something that might have been pity, or perhaps just weary contempt. "Major, the woman you know as Dr. Eris Thorne is designated Strategic Oversight Analyst Ethel. The name on her paperwork is a cover. The civilian jumpsuit is a disguise. Her official title, should you require one, is Architect and Primary Systems Authority for the entire Ethel-class Deep Earth Defense Network. Scylla, the needle, is one of her designs. She does not answer to you. You, this facility, and every piece of technology in it answer to her." The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the crew. They looked at the small, quiet woman in the gray jumpsuit, and they saw her for the first time. Not a geologist, not a civilian, the architect, the creator of their world, the ghost in her own machine. Valerius stared, his face having gone from red to white to a mottled gray. His mind simply could not process the scale of his error. He hadn't just challenged a subordinate. He had challenged the very designer of the system he was meant to command. He had stood on a ship of her making and screamed at the captain for charting a course through a storm she had predicted. His authority, his career, his identity, it all evaporated in that one devastating moment of clarity. He stumbled back a step, his mouth opening and closing silently. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. "Major Valerius," the voice on the comm continued, its tone now cold and final. "You are hereby relieved of command, effective immediately. Consider yourself under confinement to your quarters. You will speak to no one. A tribunal will be convened upon your extraction to assess your performance. Sergeant Rostova." "Sir," Rostova snapped to attention, her voice sharp. "You will assume temporary operational command of Scylla until a replacement arrives. Your authority will be seconded by Analyst Ethel. You will follow her directives without question. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Rostova breathed, her eyes darting to Thorn, a look of profound, terrified respect on her face. "Good," the voice concluded. "Ethel, a recovery and repair team from Project Hephaestus is en route. ETA 48 hours. Hold the line. Out." The channel went dead. The silence that descended was deeper than any that had come before. It was the silence of a new world being born. Major Valerius stood for a moment longer, a hollowed-out man in a perfect uniform. Then, without a word, he turned and walked off the command deck, his steps slow and unsteady, the sound of his gleaming boots no longer authoritative, but merely pathetic. His fall was absolute. In the days that followed, a new order settled over the Needle. The frantic energy of the crisis was replaced by a quiet, focused industry. The remaining crew, under Sergeant Rostova's steady guidance and Thorn's silent oversight, began the arduous process of damage control and repair. The atmosphere was transformed. The previous culture, built on the loud, brittle foundation of Valerius's ego, was gone. In its place was a quiet competence, a shared sense of purpose born from a shared trauma and a shared salvation. Eris Thorn, or Analyst Ethel, as they now thought of her, became a figure of myth. She rarely spoke, returning to her alcove and her glowing screens, but her presence was a constant, powerful force. Crew members would walk past her station with a new reverence, their voices dropping to a whisper. They looked at her not with fear, but with a kind of intellectual awe. She had shown them a different kind of power, one not derived from rank or regulation, but from pure, unassailable knowledge. She had become the silent, watchful soul of the facility. Rostova, now the acting commander, adapted to her new role with the same pragmatism she had shown in the crisis. She did not try to emulate Valerius's bluster. Instead, she led with questions, with trust in her subordinates, and with an unwavering deference to Thorn. On the second day after the attack, she approached Thorn's alcove, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She placed one on the edge of Thorn's console, without a word. Thorn looked up, her eyes registering the offering. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Rostova hesitated for a moment, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "The way you use the aquifer, you treated it like a fiber optic cable, a waveguide for resonance. Is that something that can be taught?" It was not praise. It was a request for knowledge, the ultimate sign of respect. Thorn considered the question for a moment, her gaze distant. "The principles are simple," she said, her voice quiet. Matter is just organized energy. Everything has a frequency. If you can find the frequency, you can control the matter. The teaching is not in the how, it is in the how to listen. She turned back to her screen, the conversation over. Rostova stood for a moment longer, then nodded to herself and walked away, the simple answer having given her more to think about than a year at a command college. 48 hours later, as promised, the rescue team arrived. They were not a standard military unit. They were specialists from Project Hephaestus, engineers and scientists in similar gray jumpsuits, their faces grim and focused. They moved with a quiet efficiency that mirrored Thorne's own. Their leader, a stern-faced man with the title of foreman, approached Thorne's station. "Analyst Ethel," he said with a respectful nod. "The transport is ready. Your work here is concluded." Thorne powered down her custom rig, the glowing waterfalls of data winking out of existence one by one. She stood, her small frame seeming to carry an impossible weight of knowledge. She gave one last look around the CIC, at the patched walls and the exhausted but orderly crew. Her gaze met Rostova's across the room. The sergeant gave her a crisp, formal nod. It was a salute from one professional to another. Thorne acknowledged it with a slight inclination of her head, and then she turned and walked away. She followed the foreman to the newly cleared turbolift, stepping inside without a backward glance. She had arrived as an anonymous geologist and was leaving as a savior and a specter. As the doors slid shut, she disappeared from their lives as quietly as she had entered, leaving behind nothing but a functioning bunker and a legend that would be told in hushed tones for years to come. She was a quiet professional, a ghost in the vast, complex machine of the deep earth network she had built. Her triumphs were silent, her battles fought in the invisible realms of frequency and code. She did not seek recognition or command. She sought only the success of the mission, the elegant solution to the impossible problem. The men and women of the Needle would never forget the lesson she taught them, that in the face of true crisis, the loudest voice is often the most fragile, and that the most profound power belongs to those who have the wisdom to listen to the silence. She left behind not a legacy of personality, but of principle, a stark, austere monument to the fact that competence, in the end, is the only authority that truly matters.